We have so many stories of men at war, the heroes that were made and the lives that were lost. However, Kristen Hannah does a great job at telling the stories that have been largely ignored and untold. The stories of the women who lived through these wars and who fought and died for their countries as well. In the novel The Nightingale, we hear about two of these women who lived in France during World War II. In this episode, we will be delving into the plot, characters, and themes of The Nightingale. So let's dive in. This book is a dual POV novel that follows two sisters during their time in World War II. Vianne is married to Antoine, and they have one of the happiest marriages in all of literature. They just had their daughter Sophie, and the war is on the horizon, but neither of them think that it will come to their small town in France. That is until Germany invades France. Antoine is called to war, leaving Vianne to care for Sophie. Isabelle is Vianne's younger sister, who's looking for purpose. The whole getting married and having a family life just doesn't seem to fit. So she is searching for something else. The main conflict in this novel is man versus man, or how do people survive during war. Although there are a number of subtopics that make this book real and devastating, each of them tie back to that main idea of surviving the time of the war. During World War II, Vianne is strong for her daughter, trying to keep her alive during one of the most difficult and devastating periods in French history. Yes, this was not the first time that Germany had invaded France, but this is the first time they did so with purpose, to eliminate the Jews. We see this happen to Vianne's neighbors, who she loved and relied on, as they are taken away to camp, never to be seen again, and Vianne takes in their son to save him from the same fate. Vianne also has to have soldiers live with her, since she has extra rooms in her home. One of these men is kind, and one is a monster. But we'll talk more about them later. However, the most impactful part of this book for me was Vianne's struggle to feed and take care of her daughter. The scene where hundreds of people were fleeing from northern France down, destroying everything in their wake, was one of the most haunting scenes in this book. Her garden that she'd been working so hard on for all those years just gone overnight. Just devastating. Of course, Isabelle's story was more compelling. Being a spy for France and saving people from the German occupation was, of course, fascinating to read about. Isabelle had countless encounters that she could have been killed, yet she found true purpose for her life in saving others. Talking about Isabelle leads us to the end of the novel. Isabelle being captured and tortured was difficult to read about, but when she returns to Vianne, a shadow of herself, and we have to watch her slowly decline, it's heartbreaking. However, we do get that warm moment of Antoine returning home, and the two of them picking their lives back together. What was interesting about this novel was the two timelines we are jumping between. Although we spend most of our time in the past, we do get a few moments from Vianne's future self as she's accepting a award for Isabelle. We almost get the idea that Isabelle is still alive, but then we are completely devastated when we learn how she passes. I thought the way that Hannah pieces this book together was brilliant, and it helped to focus on the hardship of these women during that time. So let's move to characters. Although Isabelle was a fascinating character, I related most to Vianne. Vianne was a realist. She had good, strong values and was so happy with the choices she had made. She was strong and brave. Even though she wasn't going around saving lives, she was surviving and saving Sophie's life as well as Ari. It was the small things Vianne did that made her a hero, as well as her sister. Vianne's journey through the book was, of course, heartbreaking, but it shows us that being an everyday hero, is just as important. Her small acts of rebellion and her ability to make do with so little was inspiring. I hope to never have to be in that situation, but when you read about women like Vianne and all the other women who lived through such a terrible thing, you can see that people are capable of so much more. I also love the older Vianne's insights. Here are a couple of quotes that just stood out to me. Today's young people want to know everything about everyone. They think talking about a problem will solve it. I come from a quieter generation. We understand the value of forgetting, the lure of reinvention. Quote 2. They are not lost, nor are they in a better place. They are gone. As I approach the end of my years, I know that grief, like regrets, settles into our DNA and remains forever a part of us. End quote. Vianne was the perfect character to focus this novel on because of her everyday type of bravery and her wise and profound statements. Isabel is one of those women that you love reading about. She is brave, strong, and adventurous. I loved seeing bits of Vianne and her past from Isabel's point of view and learning about their parents and how they become the people they became. Isabel was very brave and found herself working as a spy. I love this quote from her. Beauty was just another way to discount her, to not see her. End quote. Like the women in the Alice Network, Isabel, codenamed Nightingale, is able to use her femininity to help others. She saved so many people and paid the ultimate price for her sacrifice. Like Eve from the Alice Network, Isabel was tortured and sent to a concentration camp. However, the work camps from World War II were far more severe than in World War I, and Isabel didn't have the same network that Eve did. I loved this heartbreaking quote from Isabel's time with the Nazis. It doesn't hurt, it just hurts my body. They can't touch my soul. End quote. This mantra saved Isabel and is such a beautiful moment. Although it was heartbreaking, she didn't let them break her, and she kept the important part of her safe. Isabel represented hundreds of women in the war that worked quietly as spies, doing small things for the army. Because women were still underestimated, they were able to be more capable spies than many of their male counterparts. It was so cool to read a book about women and women like Vianne, who did their part to win the war. And speaking of war, let's move to themes. If I have learned anything in this long life of mine, it is this. In love, we find out who we want to be. In war, we find out who we are. End quote. The most clear topic in this book is war. The effects of war not only on the people fighting in it, but the people living through it. Throughout the novel, we see the effects of war and how it breaks people. I think the best way to talk about this quote is by looking at the two different soldiers that stayed with Vianne, Captain Beck and von Richter. Captain Beck is a kind man who has a family of his own at home. For him, being part of Hitler's Germany was not great, but he was doing what was best for the people he cared for. Beck aids Vianne in getting papers for Ari and turns a blind eye to her other affairs. While things are rough for both Beck and Vianne, they seem to understand each other. However, after Isabel saves the American pilot and hides them in their barn, she has to shoot Beck, leaving an ugly mess for her sister and everyone else involved. Then, von Richter comes to live with Vianne. Von Richter is an evil man. He has let the war bring out the worst in him. He uses his knowledge to blackmail Vianne. He also beats her and threatens Sophie. Unlike Beck, Richter uses his being a Nazi in the worst way possible. He's everything you think of when you think of the word Nazi. I love the juxtaposition of these two characters. It proves that the first statement was true. War brought out the character of these two men, just as it brought out the goodness and strength in both Vianne and Isabel. Here's another quote. Vianne didn't hesitate. She knew now that no one could be neutral, not anymore. And as afraid as she was of risking Sophie's life, she was suddenly more afraid of letting her daughter grow up in a world where good people did nothing to stop evil, where a good woman could turn her back on a friend in need. She reached for the toddler, took him in her arms. End quote. Vianne saving this boy was one of my favorite parts of the novel. She took him in as a son and helped her neighbor when she was able to keep him safe when he would have otherwise died. Although Ari made Vianne vulnerable, she had to do what was right for her daughter and for herself. This sacrifice reminds me of the hundreds who hid their friends and neighbors in Germany during World War II. These people put their own lives in danger to try to save the people they loved. The last quote about war that stood out to me was this: "We are all fragile. It's the thing we learn in war." End quote. Although the war made many of these people strong, it also wore them down to the lowest they could go. It was in those moments that we learned the true nature of these people. Yes, they are strong, but at their core, everyone has a breaking point. The women in this book and in Europe during World War II might not have been soldiers, but they were strong in other ways. They had to be creative with their food stores and recipes. They had to help each other, keep each other alive, and they supported the men at war by making things for them as well. Men may have fought the war, but that didn't mean that the women had it any easier. The next topic this book covers is love. Being set in France, it's only fitting that there are a few love stories in the novel. Here's the first quote that stood out to me. "Some stories don't have happy endings, even love stories, maybe especially love stories." End quote. Although this quote is heartbreaking, it's sadly realistic. Most stories are tragedies. However, we can see that there are many different kinds of love in the novel. Let's start with the love that V and Antoine shared in this quote. "How fragile life was, how fragile they were. Love. It was the beginning and end of everything, the foundation and the ceiling, and the air in between. It didn't matter that she was broken and ugly and sick. He loved her, and she loved him. All her life she had waited, longed for people to love her, but now she saw what she really mattered. She had been known, been blessed by it." Here's another one of my favorite quotes. "He loves a version of me that is incomplete. I always thought it was what I wanted, to be loved and admired. Now I think perhaps I'd like to be known." End quote. Deep down, I think the most important thing to all of us is to be understood. We want the people we love to know us at that deeper level, to be able to read our minds, or just be able to look at us and know us. Unfortunately, that kind of love takes time and vulnerability, which is difficult but important. This quote reminds me of Vianne at the end of the novel, when Antoine and her are reunited. They love each other, it's clear, but in order to move forward, they have to keep a part of themselves back. Maybe at some point, Vianne told him the full story, but maybe not. As she says in the novel, their son was Anton's son, even if he wasn't genetically his. It makes you question, though, can you ever really know a person? I think you can. Even if you have to keep things from the person you love, you can still know them. You can still know them from what they do, how they treat you, and how they treat those around you. The last quote I found about love was this quote here: "Love has to be stronger than hate, or there is no future for us." This quote resonated with me because it's something that we need today. Love needs to be stronger than hate if we hope to have a future. This is difficult in a conflict like World War II, where people on both sides have lost people. However, as a world, we have largely been able to move past this moment and learn to love again. Love is an important part of what we need in this country right now. All I see on both sides of the political aisle is vitriol and venom, and that is being exacerbated by social media. My challenge to you is next time you see an article or a post that makes you angry, take a moment and check the source before you give it your time and energy. Of course, the most important topic this book covers is the power of women. I discussed this a little bit in talking about war, since I do think the central message of this book was war. However, there are a number of quotes that stood out to me about women and war. Here's the first one. Men tell stories. Women get on with it. For us, it was a shadow war. There were no parades for us when it was over, no medals or mentions in history books. We did what we had to do during the war, and when it was over, we picked up the pieces of our lives and started again. End quote. Everyone deals with tragedy differently. For so much of history, we have focused on men's role in the war and their fight as soldiers. However, in the 21st century, we have seen a focus on women's history and women's role in the war as well. For many of these women, the war did not just end when the war ended. They had to continue taking care of their families and the men who came back as pieces of themselves, or maybe didn't come back at all. Yet there are no parades or taverns where women come to reminisce about their time. No, women were just expected to carry on as normal. It's crazy to me that that was the case, but I love that this book, like many others, are focusing on writing women's roles in the war. Here's another quote that stood out to me. I am a mother, and mothers don't have the luxury of falling apart in front of their children, even when they're afraid, even when their children are adults. End quote. This quote rings true about any leader, and mothers are important leaders of their family. It must have been so difficult for these women to stay strong for their children and for each other. I also love the second part of this quote, that mothers still have to be strong even when their children are adults. The bonds between mothers and their children is so important. Even though we grow up and move on, we all still love and rely on our mothers. Everyone who's lost their mom will tell you that they didn't realize how much they loved and needed their mom until she was gone. The last quote that stood out to me was this. Why was it so easy for men in the world to do as they wanted and so difficult for women? End quote. I think this quote represents the age-old question. Even now in 2024, when things are moving more and more towards equality, it is still more difficult to be a woman. I love this straightforward moment that calls out inequality and asks the difficult question. We learn so many things from the women in this book and how to be strong even when everyone and everything is going wrong around you. These women were starving, alone, and they still were there for the people that needed them. They were brave, loyal, and the war brought the best qualities out in them. I rated this book 5 out of 5 stars. It is a great dedication to the women who lived through World War II and who helped with the war effort in their own way. I loved that this book showed the past and the present of Vianne. Her wisdom sprinkled in throughout the novel elevated this novel and also kept us guessing. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of According to Your English Teacher. If you'd like to hear more videos like this or have a great suggestion for your next book club, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Being a subscriber means that you know when my videos drop. I would also love to hear your thoughts about the novel. Before you leave today, make sure you leave a comment on the video and give it a thumbs up. Tell me what your favorite part of this book was. I love to see what other people say, and this could help spark a discussion. If you're listening to the podcast, make sure to give this podcast a review. If you want to keep up with what I'm currently reading, make sure to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or on Goodreads. Also feel free to shoot me an email at yet33@gmail.com. I'd like to leave you with one last quote. Don't think about who they are. Think about who you are and what sacrifices you can live with and what will break you. End quote. This episode of According to Your English Teacher was written by me, Sam Gunther, and edited by Dallin Gunther. The music was done by Tom Brinton. Please join us next week as we discuss The Great Alone. I hope you have a great day and happy reading.